All right. Thank you all for joining us for this plant identification training. I'm Diana Diggs, the Huron Pines AmeriCorps member serving at Michigan Nature Association, or M&A as we usually call it. And tonight I'm joined by some of the M&A staff. So from the stewardship team, we have Rachel and Zach. And from the outreach team, we have Julie and Lauren on the call with us. In case anyone is not familiar with M&A, we're a nonprofit membership-based organization with over 180 nature sanctuaries throughout the state of Michigan, with a mission to acquire, protect, and maintain natural areas that contain examples of Michigan's endangered and threatened flora, fauna, and their habitats. So before we get any further, I want to give a huge thank you to Phyllis Higman at Michigan Natural Features Inventory, who allowed us to use her presentation for the basis of this training. I also want to mention that I'll be using a lot of the terminology that we covered in the first plant identification webinar. So if you feel like you're getting a little bit lost, you can view the recording of that webinar, which is on our YouTube channel. And then once this recording is added to the channel, you can view this one again. And just one tech thing before we get started. We have everyone on mute in order to avoid any background noise, but we encourage you to write any questions in the chat box. So if you are on your phone, you can press the 3 dots highlighted in the green box here, and then hit the chat button, which is shown in the blue box. If you're joining us from a computer, you can click on the chat button that is highlighted in yellow. And we'll have some time for questions, but if we aren't able to get to your question tonight, we'll include them in the follow-up email to everyone. And even after the webinar, feel free to email myself or Rachel any questions you can think of. So first, we're going to talk today about the distinction between native, alien, and invasive species. We're going to look at how to identify different species throughout the year, and then how to distinguish them from some of their native and non-native lookalikes. And we'll have a question break at the middle and at the end of the presentation. So in 1999, President Clinton signed the executive order, which established the National Invasive Species Council. And these are the legal definitions from that executive order. But basically, a native species is a species that, other than as a result of an introduction, historically occurred or occurs in that particular habitat. An alien species is any species, including its reproductive or vegetative parts, that are capable of propagating that species and is not native to that habitat. So some other terms that you might see are non-native, exotic, and non-indigenous. And then an invasive species is one that is non-native to that particular habitat and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So the first invasive species we're going to look at is black swallow-wort, which is native to Europe and was introduced to the US in the 1800s. It's an herbaceous or non-woody perennial vine that can reach up to 6 feet in length. So perennial means that it'll grow back every year from the same roots. And it is found in a variety of habitats because it can tolerate a large range of light and soil conditions, but it thrives and produces the most fruit when it's in the sun. So this is what it looks like when it first sprouts in spring. You can see the simple opposite leaves, so that's 2 leaves per node, and these emit a pungent herbal smell when you crush them. And then in spring, when you first start seeing the shoots, a helpful tip for identification can be to look for the old twining vines nearby. As they grow in spring, you can see some of the leaf characteristics. So that opposite leaf arrangement and the entire or smooth margin. And the leaf shape varies really widely in this species. So the leaves that are closer to the ground are often wider and more elliptic than the ones at the top of the plant, which tend to be lanceolate in shape, meaning they're longer than wide, and they have the widest point below the middle of the leaf blade. And you can see that all of them have these sharply pointed tips there. And the leaves range in size from 2 to 5 inches long to 1 to 2.5 inches wide. And as the season progresses, you can see how it starts to overtake an area and form dense monocultures, which it's capable of doing in sunny areas and also in shady areas like you see here. It is a vine, so it has these twining stems that can climb or creep around adjacent plants or other objects. By late spring to early summer, they produce these small 5-petaled dark purple flowers that are covered in a fine light hairs on the upper surface of the petals. And they are clustered in the leaf axils and have a slightly rotting smell. And these flowers typically bloom from June to August, so in that leaf axil area there. In summer, the fruits develop and resemble those of some of our native milkweeds, but the fruits of swallow-wort are more slender than the native milkweeds, and the pods split open sometime in summer or fall and release their wind-borne seeds. So here you can see where the seed pod has split open, and each of these flat brown seeds is attached to a tuft of hair that helps it disperse over large areas in the fall. So they are dispersed by the wind. And then in late fall, you start to see the dried stems and the open seed pods. And the dispersing seeds, you can sometimes just see those seeds floating in the wind from those tufts of hair. And then in winter, you can see the persistent empty seed pods there. So one of the lookalikes for this one is pale swallow-wort, which is also an invasive species. And you can see that they're both these twining vines that climb on other objects. The flowers of the pale swallow-wort are also small, 5-petaled, and have a slightly rotting smell. But the difference is that the petals are paler, more pink in color, and hairless. They also differ in shape. The petals of black swallow-wort are about the same length and width, but the petals of pale swallow-wort are narrower and longer than they are wide. So similar to the swallow-worts is the gray dogwood, especially young dogwoods, because they also have a simple opposite leaf arrangement and an entire leaf margin. But gray dogwoods are a woody shrub and not a vine. And you can see that their flowers look very different from the flowers of the swallow-wort. And also the fruits are these berry-like fruits versus the pod-like fruits of the swallow-worts. So these next lookalikes, the milkweeds and the dogbanes, are in the same family as the swallow-worts. So that is the dogbane family. And one common characteristic of this family is that it has simple, usually opposite leaves, which is why you might confuse it with the swallow-wort. Another common characteristic for most of the dogbane family is that if you break the stem of a plant, it usually has a milky sap. But swallow-wort has a watery sap. So that's one way to tell them apart. Another way to distinguish them is to look at the plant's habit or growth form. So the swallow-worts are vines, but our native milkweeds and dogbanes are generally herbaceous, non-twining plants. And whereas All of them have these similar pod-like fruits. The pods of milkweeds are larger, and the pods of like this Indian hemp here are longer and more narrow than that of the swallow-wort. Also, the flowers of both of these would be really distinctive from the flowers of the swallow-wort as well. All right, Rachel, could you launch the first poll? So what species does not have a pod-like fruit? I'll give everyone a little bit of time to answer it. Looks like we've got 10 of 12, so you can probably share it now, Rachel. And it looks like everyone said gray dogwood, and you would be correct. All right. So gray dogwood's going to have that berry-like fruit versus those pod-like fruits. So the next invasive we're going to look at is Eurasian Phragmites, which is a tall herbaceous perennial grass with wide leaves. It spreads by seed, rhizomes, and fragments from nodes, and it invades a lot of wetland areas where it can survive in water up to almost 2 meters deep. So it can spread, it can reproduce and distribute in 3 different ways, which is why it's so invasive. It can spread by the seeds being blown by the wind or moved by water. It can spread through underground rhizomes and by above ground stolons as well. So rhizomes are modified stems that develop below ground, and plants can arise from the underground nodes on these stems. So here you can see at these nodes, new plants are forming. So it grows roots and shoots and creates new plants that way as well. These rhizomes can exceed 60 feet in length and can grow more than 6 feet per year. And if you try and remove them manually like this, if you leave a piece of this rhizome, if you have a fragment of it that has one of those nodes on it, there's a good chance that it'll produce another plant and grow back. So that's one of the reasons that this is so difficult to remove. So stolons are modified stems that grow horizontally above the ground, and roots and shoots will develop at the nodes, so they're able to produce more plants along the lengths of the stolon as well. So here is this above ground modified stem, and just like the rhizomes at these nodes, it'll produce roots and shoots and new plants throughout this modified stem as well. So in spring, it starts to grow, and it likes to grow in areas that receive a lot of nutrient runoff and road salt, which is why you see it along the roadsides a lot. So now we're going to look at some of the identification characteristics for this species. So the leaves are typical leaves in the grass family, and they have parallel venation, meaning that their veins on the leaf blade run parallel to each other. And the leaves are alternately arranged on the stem, so 1 leaf per node. And the leaves are 10 to 20 inches long and up to 1.5 inches wide. The leaves are bluish green in color. They're flat and hairless and mostly smooth on both the lower and upper surface of the leaf blade. And then they also taper to this point at the end of the leaf. So I just want to cover a few of the grass structures that will help with identifying them. So the first is the culm, which is the grass stem, and then the leaf blade, which on Phragmites is wide and alternate, and the leaf sheath, which is this part right here. And this is the part at the base of the blade that goes down and encircles the stem. And it can be loose or tight around the stem. And then last is the ligule. So this is the area on the upper surface of the leaf, which it's joined to the sheath. And this can be membranous, like a piece of tissue. It can be a fringe of hairs. It can be a combination of the two, or the absence of it sometimes is what is used as part of an identification feature. So the ligule on Eurasian Phragmites is a fringe of long hairs. And the sheaths are also smooth, and they stay attached to the plant as the plant matures. They also have this swollen portion on the stem, that's the node. And on Phragmites, it can be green to purplish, and it has this ring of fine hairs along the upper edge. So another important term is inflorescence, which is the flowering part of a plant. So this is where the seeds are produced. So sometimes you'll see it called the seed head, especially in grasses. And each of these Phragmites plant can produce hundreds to thousands of seeds each year. So in summer, the inflorescence is purplish in color, and it is 15 to 50 centimeters long and 6 to 20 centimeters wide. So here's a picture of a monoculture of Phragmites in summer, and you can see those purple inflorescence. And then in fall, the inflorescence change from that purplish color to this straw color. And then in winter, this is when you can see that the sheaths have stayed on the stem, and you can see that the inflorescence starts to look fluffy due to these feathery hairs that are attached to the seeds. And the above ground growth of Phragmites can persist through the winter, which is one of the reasons it forms these dense stands, because each year's growth will intermix with the next. And also the underground network of roots and rhizomes persists through winter and stores energy for the coming year. So the first lookalike for the Eurasian Phragmites is wild rice. So this grass also grows in wetlands and can get fairly tall like the invasive Phragmites, but it has a looser, less dense, and non-feathery inflorescence. The next is reed canary grass, which though it's native in some parts of North America, it appears that most colonies found here in the Midwest are the European form. So the one here in Michigan is invasive, and it forms really dense monocultures and chokes out a lot of our native vegetation. And it's becoming a serious problem, especially in wetlands in southern Michigan. So both the invasive Phragmites and reed canary grass tend to grow in similar habitats, and they particularly like disturbed areas. But reed canary grass has a tighter inflorescence, and it has a membranous or like thin papery ligule versus the hairy ligule that we saw on the invasive Phragmites. So blue joint is also a grass that grows in wet habitats and spreads by rhizomes, but blue joint doesn't get as tall as Phragmites, and the leaves of blue joint are more narrow. So the last lookalike is the toughest one because it's actually just a different subspecies from the invasive one. So they have a lot of characteristics in common. This one is native though, and one of the most easily seen differences is the red stems that are exposed when the sheaths fall off. So like we mentioned, in winter, you can see that the sheath doesn't fall off of the invasive one. But in the native subspecies, that sheath does fall off and reveals these naked stems that are reddish in color. And this just shows those stems side by side so that you can see the difference, this kind of tan color, that sheath is still on there versus this naked stem with the reddish color. So leaves of the invasive subspecies are a bluish gray green, while the native ones are typically a lighter yellow green. And this is a good characteristic to look at if you think you have them growing side by side, because that's when it's the easiest to see that distinction. So the native inflorescence is less robust than the invasive species, which is really densely flowered. And another thing is that the invasive species tends to have tougher stems and it doesn't deteriorate as rapidly as the native subspecies. So this just shows the two side by side, and you can see how much denser that inflorescence is on the invasive one. And also you can see it's significantly taller than the native one as well. And then another difference is the ligule. So they both do have a lower membranous portion of the ligule, and then they have a fringe of hairs on top of that. But the difference is that the ligule for the invasive one is shorter than the one on the native. And then another difference is that the ligule of the native is more likely to shred and fray by midsummer. So a frayed ligule would be something to look for when identifying in the fall. So this is just a helpful comparison chart from the Michigan Sea Grant. It goes over some of those the characteristics that we just talked about. So the stem color, leaf color, rhizomes, the growth habit where the native one doesn't block out the diversity of other plants and the invasive one tends to create dense monocultures. And then that the leaf sheaths fall off of the native and not on the invasive. All right, so we're going to take the first question break. Are there any questions in the chat box, Rachel?
Well, not yet, but if anyone would like to pose a question in the chat box, staff or stewards or Huron Pines folks, please take the opportunity. This is the only question break we have, but we will also have another opportunity at the end for your questions.
But if we don't have anything right now, we can keep going.
Yeah, we certainly can. I will, oh, hey, great. So this question from Nancy Goodrich, she's asking if native Phragmites is a good thing. And the answer to that is yes. We have native Phragmites at a handful of our sanctuaries, and you know, where it is occurring, it is, I like to say it plays well in the sandbox. You know, you can still see a ton of other native vegetation underneath. The stands are a lot less dense. They don't really expand in the same way. And so yeah, just it's kind of your typical happy native species. So, and then Janine Palms is asking, how common is the native Phragmites? That's a really good question. I can only speak to what I've seen at the M&A sanctuaries. That's mostly where I've seen it. But I think a lot of that is because I'm just getting far off trail in these places and intimately knowing them a little bit better than than other places. One place you might be able to actually, I was going to say, typically I would check Michigan Flora online for their range distribution map, but when Diana and I were when mostly Diana was preparing this presentation, we were kind of looking at that range map and realized that on Michigan Flora, for whatever reason, it has the same entry for the native and non-native. And so you can't tell which county occurrence is the native versus the non. I suspect that it is more common than we think. It's just a matter of, certainly probably less common at this point than the invasive, unfortunately. But, and then let's see, we'll take one more question at this point from Dan Burton. He's asking, why do we treat Phragmites at the end of the season versus earlier or mid-season while it's shorter? And I believe a lot of this has to do with when the Phragmites begins to flower, and this is true with most plants, they are putting a lot of their energy into flowering and not into growth. And so if you treat something earlier in the season when it's still putting a lot of energy into growth, there's the possibility that it could overcome the zap of the herbicide. Whereas, once it started to put its energy into flowering, it is quite a bit more vulnerable. It's towards the end, it's starting to getting to the end of its growth for the season, starting to die back a little bit. And so I think that's just kind of the optimal timing. I can look into that a little bit more. That's actually just my theory. Just based on what I know about plants in general, but I can come up with a better response from the internet for that. And with that, I think, Diana, we've given your voice a rest. And so we will proceed to the last half of the presentation, but continue as you have questions, please type them in and then we'll address them at the end.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. All right, so next we're going to talk about Japanese knotweed, which is an invasive from Japan. So it's a shrub-like herbaceous perennial that can grow up to about 10 feet in height. It can be found in a lot of wetland type areas and can tolerate a wide array of soil and moisture conditions. So this is what it looks like when it first sprouts in early spring. And you can see the previous year's dead stems. So these will not initiate new growth, and soon they'll be hidden by the coming year's growth. And as it begins to leaf out in spring, you can see the simple alternate one leaf per node arrangement, and also that it has a smooth or entire leaf margin. And the blades are really distinctive. So they have an elliptic shape where they are broadest in the middle of the leaf blade. And then they also have this really abrupt pointed tip and a flat base. And these leaves can get up to 6 inches long and 5 inches wide. So another good identification characteristic are the arching stems. And sometimes they have these red petioles. So that's the stalk that attaches the leaf blade to the stem. So also in spring, you can start seeing its shrub-like habit with the multiple stems down here at the base. And eventually they form these dense thickets that shade out the native plants. And this is partially due to the really robust rhizome systems that they have. And you can see that when you cut into one of these, it has this bright orange color. So these are some of the key identification characteristics that you can see in spring through fall. So the first is a structure called an ochrea. This is a plant structure that formed when the stipules fused into a sheath that surrounds the stem. So on Japanese knotweed, it looks like a collar that goes around the node. And the presence of this structure is a major diagnostic characteristic for identifying members of this family, which is commonly called either the buckwheat or the knotweed family. So some of the other characteristics of the stems are that they are round and hollow. So they do look similar to bamboo, but the leaves of knotweed are much broader, and they have the pinnate venation versus that parallel venation that is typical of grasses that bamboo has. They also have stems that have this waxy whitish coating that rubs off easily. They have swollen nodes along the stem, which is another really good identifying feature of the knotweed family. So Japanese knotweed blooms in summer, generally from August through September, and they have numerous small green or whitish flowers on slender stalks that arise from the leaf axils and the stem tips. So here you can see these spikes of white flowers. In fall, the fruits form. They are white and winged on 3 sides, and the seeds are dark brown and glossy and about 1/10 of an inch. And these winged fruits are also characteristic of the buckwheat or knotweed family. In the late fall, as the weather turns colder, the plants lose their leaves, and they leave behind these upright brown stems, which then persist through winter in these clumps that you see here. Giant knotweed is another invasive in Michigan, and it is also a member of the buckwheat family. So it does share some of the characteristics with Japanese knotweed, such as the swollen nodes and the ochrea, that collar around the node. And it also has the spikes of axillary white flowers. But the distinguishing characteristic between the two is the leaves. So whereas the Japanese knotweed has a flat leaf base, giant knotweed has a lobed, rounded, or cordate leaf base. And also the leaves of giant knotweed can get up to 16 inches long, which is significantly larger than the leaves of Japanese knotweed, which get up to about 6 inches long. All right, time for the second poll. What is the leaf arrangement of Japanese knotweed? Give everyone just a few moments to answer. We've got 75% voted, so yeah. I'm going to share those results. It looks like everyone that answered said alternate, which is correct. That's 1 leaf per node. So the next one we're going to cover is common buckthorn, which is a deciduous woody shrub to small tree. And they can get up to 25 feet in height. So it is from Eurasia, and it was brought here partially through cultivation. And it's become a serious problem in southern Michigan because of its ability to form thickets and invade open woods and prairies. It has prolific fruit and seed production, and the seeds are widely dispersed by birds. So the first leaves of common buckthorn are rectangular, which is a good diagnostic feature when they first start to sprout in spring. So similar to other invasive species, common buckthorn leaves out early in spring, which allows it to shade out native wildflowers and other tree seedlings, and causes a decrease in overall biodiversity. And leaves of the common buckthorn are a good vegetative feature to look at in spring and summer for identification. So the leaves are simple and dark green with 3 to 5 pairs of prominent veins that curve as they approach the leaf tip. So they come off of the midrib and they curve up to the top of that leaf. So this is called arcuate venation. The leaves are sub-opposite, but they can appear opposite or alternate on the stem. So sub-opposite means that they're not exactly at the same level on the node. So one leaf is slightly higher than the other one. And another thing that sometimes they'll have that can help with identification is this thorn at the tip of the stem there. So unlike the other species we've looked at, this leaf has a toothed margin. So it's these small projections along the leaf edge there. And they usually start blooming in May, and they have small greenish to yellow 4-petaled flowers that are clustered around the stem. And they have 2 different kinds of flowers that appear on different plants. So on one plant, you'll have the staminate flowers. So these are the ones that have the stamens and produce pollen. And then on a separate plant, you'd have the carpellate flowers. And these are the ones that contain either the carpel or pistil. They both mean the same thing. And these are the flowers that actually produce the fruits. So then in summer and fall, the flowers are pollinated and the fruits form. And at first they are green berries. And then as they mature, they turn black. And these fruits will only form on the plants with those carpellate flowers. And so one of the key features in winter are these round pea-sized black berries that persist throughout the winter. And generally, they're these clusters of berries. So similar to how leaves have an arrangement on the stems, the buds and branches have a same arrangement on the stem. So in winter, you can look for those sub-opposite buds and branching. So this one's just slightly higher there. And the bark of common buckthorn is really varied, but generally it is gray to brown and dotted with vertical light colored lenticels. So these white spots here. And as it ages, the bark gets this peely texture. And then the inner bark of this species is this bright orange. So as Rachel refers to it, pumpkin orange, which is a good diagnostic feature for it. So next we're going to look at another invasive buckthorn, which is glossy buckthorn. So this is a deciduous shrub or small tree that can grow up to 20 feet tall. It is spread by the birds that eat its berries, and it invades a lot of wetlands, especially prairie fens, but it can occur in uplands as well. So similar to common buckthorn, glossy buckthorn leaves out early, usually around mid-May. You can see the leaves for identification purposes, spring through fall. So they're obovate, meaning that they are wider above the middle part of the leaf blade. And these blades range from 1 to 2.5 inches long. They have an entire leaf margin, and they are shiny and dark green in color. And they have pinnate venation. So they have a prominent midrib and these secondary veins. And one of the unique characteristics of the secondary veins on this glossy buckthorn is that as it gets close to the leaf margin, the tip of these veins start to curve up towards the top of the leaf. So glossy buckthorn's blooming period is typically from May to September, and its flowers are 5-petaled and creamy white to greenish white, and they arise in clusters of 2 to 8 flowers in the leaf axils. So in the pictures on the right are just to show the comparison of the common buckthorn flowers to the glossy buckthorn flowers. So starting in July and going through September, they produce an abundant amount of fleshy pea-sized fruits that at first are light green, and then they turn red, and as they ripen, they turn black in late summer. So this photo was taken in early October, and you can see how the other leaves around it are changing colors, but the glossy buckthorn in this understory is still green. So it's still photosynthesizing, which it's doing it longer than a lot of the other natives, which is one of the reasons it has this competitive advantage. And it's also one of the things that can help you identify it in the fall. So the key features for identification in winter are the berries, the bark, and the buds. So the buds of glossy buckthorn are naked, and they have these like rust-colored hairs, and they look fuzzy. They're also going to be alternately arranged on the stem. The bark is gray or brown with varying degrees of patchy white and round lenticels, and the twigs of this one are thornless. So though both of these invasive buckthorns share some common characteristics, there are some ways to tell them apart. So glossy buckthorn has alternate leaves and an entire margin. So there are no teeth along the margin of the leaf blade. And the veins go from the midrib to the edge before they curve up. But on common buckthorn, it has the sub-opposite leaves. They have rounded teeth along the leaf margin, and the veins go from the midrib and curve to the tip of the leaf. So one of the key characteristics of glossy buckthorn bark is that it has a dark purplish cast when it's young, but as it ages, it becomes more gray. It has prominent white lenticels, and it is yellow when it's cut. Whereas the common buckthorn bark is brown to gray, and it becomes peely as it matures. And also when you cut into it, it has that jack-o'-lantern orange color on the inner bark. Black cherry is a native tree that can be confused with the invasive buckthorns. Its leaf and bud arrangement is alternate though. And if you have the leaves, there's a good way to distinguish the black cherry from the common buckthorn, because you can look at the venation. So on black cherry, it has pinnate venation, that strong midrib with secondary veins, and the common buckthorn has that arcuate, arching, curving veins here. And also, if you scrape the outer bark. So when you first do that on a black cherry, it's going to be this kind of greenish white color. And so it doesn't have that characteristic yellow or orange color that you see in the buckthorns. So it does have alternate buds with scales like common buckthorn, but there are some differences. So glossy buckthorn has alternate naked buds that are rust colored and fuzzy looking. And both common buckthorn and black cherry have imbricate or overlapping brown bud scales. But common buckthorn is going to have that sub-opposite bud arrangement, and black cherry is going to be alternate. Black cherries also lack the thorns that you occasionally see on the common buckthorn twigs. So the next look-alike is the native elderberry buckthorn, which is a spineless shrub that only gets about 3 feet tall, which is much shorter than the invasive buckthorns, which can get up to 20 and 25 feet tall. So it has alternate leaves with 8 to 9 pairs of veins that curve towards the tip of the leaf, and it has a rounded teeth on the leaf margin. One of the characteristics that helps with this one is that the leaf surface is puckered. So you can see that the texture of the leaf is not smooth like the invasive buckthorns that we looked at. Our next invasive is Japanese barberry, which is native to Asia and invasive to a lot of the Midwest. So it's a low-growing deciduous shrub with arching stems that root where they touch the ground. So it was widely cultivated and has increasingly escaped into forest, swamps, fields, and dunes. And it has become increasingly invasive in woodland settings where its seeds have been distributed largely by birds that eat its bright red fruits. So similar to other invasives, it begins to sprout early in spring. And as it starts to leaf out, you can see it's spatulate, spoon-shaped to oval-shaped leaves with these entire smooth margins. And the leaves are arranged in clusters along the stem, and these clusters are arranged alternately. So there's one cluster of leaves per node. And then under those cluster of leaves, there is a single spine. And as they grow throughout the season, the stems begin to arch, and the leaves will change from this bright green to a light green, and then in fall they'll turn like purple or red. They bloom from April to May and have pale yellow flowers with 6 petals and radial symmetry. So there's more than one line of symmetry on them. And they're arranged in clusters of 2 to 4 flowers. Barberry fruits are small, bright red, and egg-shaped berries that are less than ½ an inch long. They ripen in mid-summer, but remain on the stems into winter. And these fruits are dispersed by deer and birds. In the winter, you can identify it by its arching, spiny branches and persistent red glossy fruits. And also it has distinctive winter buds with 3 or more scales that overlap like shingles on a roof. The inner bark, wood, and roots are a really vibrant yellow, which is another good diagnostic feature. So a native lookalike to the Japanese barberry is gooseberry, which is a common thorny looking understory shrub in a lot of Michigan woodlands, but occasionally it'll be found in swamps and savannas. So like Japanese barberry, the leaves are arranged in clusters along the stem, and the clusters are alternately arranged. And there are 1 to 3 leaves in each of the clusters. And these leaves are up to 2 inches long and 2 inches wide. And they have 3 to 5 lobes on them, as well as rounded or pointed teeth. Also, the lower surface of the leaf, as well as the upper surface, is usually hairy. So the leaf is really different from that spatulate or spoon-shaped leaves of the Japanese barberry. One of the most striking features of this plant are their spine-covered berries that turn reddish purple when they ripen. And despite the prickles, they are edible to various mammals and birds. They're also edible to humans, but you have to cook them first to soften the spines. So the degree of hairiness or spininess can vary throughout the species. The spines are slender and straight and can be up to 3/4 of an inch long, and they can be solitary or they can be in groups of 2 or 3. And some stems have these really dense prickles here. One way to distinguish it from Japanese barberry is that the inner bark is not that bright yellow. So another invasive barberry in Michigan is the common barberry, but unlike Japanese barberry that has that smooth leaf margin, it has a spiny toothed margin. But similar to Japanese barberry, its leaves are in clusters that are alternate on the stem. And one of the most distinctive features of this is this 3-pronged spine at the base of each of those leaf clusters. They also have a drooping inflorescence of 10 to 20 yellow flowers compared to those small clusters of 2 to 4 flowers that you see on the Japanese barberry. All right, so I just want to quickly talk about reporting invasive species because it's really important and it's a great way to be involved in the early detection and rapid response that we need to fight invasives. So MISN has a website where you can report them, or you can download the free app and report directly from the field. So, and if you're a steward of one of our nature sanctuaries and you find an invasive species, we really appreciate it if you take a picture of it and document where it's located and pass that information on to your RSO. That way they know what invasives and where they are located at each of our sanctuaries. So these are some great resources for invasive plants in Michigan, and you can download them for free online or purchase them from the MNFI website, and I'll send the links to these tomorrow. So before we go, let's just test your new knowledge a bit. I'm going to show a picture from earlier in the presentation, and you can just call out what species you think it is. So I'll give everyone a few moments to unmute yourselves, and then you can just call them out as you see them.
Swallow-wort. Black swallow-wort.
Yes, black swallow-wort.
Glossy buckthorn.
Glossy buckthorn, yes. Alternate leaves.
Japanese knotweed.
This one's the giant knotweed, so it's got that rounded lobes on the leaf base there.
Native Phragmites.
Yes, native Phragmites. Those red stems where the sheaths have fallen off are the giveaway there.
Japanese knotweed.
Yes, so that flat leaf base is pretty distinctive.
Japanese barberry.
Spoon-shaped leaves.
That's a buckthorn, I think.
Yeah, this one's the common buckthorn, so it's got that bright orange inner bark and opposite to sub-opposite branching there.
Phragmites.
Phragmites.
The invasive one, it gets that straw-colored inflorescence in fall. Great job. So that's it for the presentation. Rachel, do we have any more questions?
We do. So, let me. Okay, so for the first first question was from John John Benke. He's asking, if you cut and daub a Phragmites, will it also kill nearby frags or that stem only? It's a good question. My suspicion is that it would only kill that specific stem. I would imagine that the frag might have the ability to compartmentalize the herbicide's effects. Also, I'm thinking just about how little you apply to a single stem. And so maybe, you know, just in terms of how systemic through the plant. I think, John, probably what you're getting at is, you know, because they are all rhizominously connected, you know, how much will that dose of herbicide, like, can it spread throughout? And I don't think so, but I'm not 100% sure. So another one that I'll have to look up. But I would say for a steward in the field, I would cut and treat each stem. That's what I usually do. Okay, next question comes from Ann Rodek. She's asking if the fruits from barberry are edible. I actually had to do a Google search on this, and it turns out that they are. That's all that I know, but yes, I would say yes and Google it to find out more. Always good to kind of do your research before taking on wild edibles, but yes. So next question comes from Becky Kenny. She's asking if the common barberry is also invasive, and yes, I believe. Diana, can you confirm that was the second species?
Yes, it is invasive, but it's actually been eradicated from most of Michigan.
Oh,
Kind of a nice, weird, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
A success story.
Yeah. And Nancy Goodrich is asking if a prescribed burn would kill Phragmites. So I think, burning is definitely a way to get rid of some of the winter thatch that builds up. So that's one of the reasons why it's used as a prescribed as a management technique. But I'm fairly certain that you have to use prescribed burning in conjunction with chemical treatments, or pretty sure, and or mowing. You know, so it's actually this brings up there's a book. Like a small book put out by the Michigan DNR. It's called A Guide to the Control and Management of Invasive Phragmites. It is available for free online. I'm going to actually just.
I think it's on my list to send in the follow-up tomorrow.
Perfect. I was going to say, like, we'll definitely be sending that to you guys, because that is just a really great clearinghouse. You know, it talks about the Phragmites life cycle. I was actually looking at that to see if I could find any more insight into Dan's question about the timing, which may be just because under pressure I wasn't able to find a good answer. But it would definitely be, that would be a good resource to consult. It did have a sentence about the time, you know, needing to optimize the timing, but it didn't give any justification as to why. So and I think that is all of the questions we have. Oh, and Nancy Goodrich is also asking, is multiflora rose an invasive that is a problem in our sanctuaries? Yes, it is. Gosh, and it's one of my least favorite to control as well, because of the really sharp, terrible thorns that always seem to find my clothing and bare skin patches. So, definitely a problem. There is this interesting, it's been a minute since I've heard the specifics, but I guess there is some native fungus that attacks multiflora rose. And I've yet to see it at one of our sanctuaries, but I've heard that it exists where, and apparently if you can like find a plant that's being affected, I believe they'll start to kind of shrivel and look sad, generally. But if you can cut a stem off of that and then like drop it into a healthy plant, I've heard that that's a good way to spread it. Those are all, I'm speaking in very, very generality, so that would be something else that I could figure out the specific name of that fungus and maybe some identifying characteristics to look out for. But so kind of good news, hopefully, if it's able to take hold and spread. And I just love that it's a native fungus as well. That typically doesn't happen with a biocontrol. It's usually taking predator predators or parasites from the plant's native habitat, which then in turn makes them a potential invasive risk, kind of secondary invasive risk for us. So yeah, well, gosh, it's 8:01. So.
Well, Rachel, I wanted to jump in and just make sure that we give Diana a big thanks, a huge thanks. Diana's been our AmeriCorps member and service started last February. And sad for us, it ends in less than 2 weeks at the end of November. So Diana's going to be leaving us. But the good news is she's going to our friends and partners, the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, for another AmeriCorps service term. So she won't be far, and she'll be applying all her great botanical knowledge in service of all the great projects that MNFI undertakes. So just wanted to say thank you, Diana. This is your last webinar. She rather would have been out in the field with all of you all this term, but she was able to put on several programs for stewards, but also for the community at large in a couple of places. And we're just really grateful for all her help and support. So thanks, Diana, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I hope to
Thanks, Diane.
still get to do some work with you guys at some point.
And before you all leave, I forgot my last duty, which was to type the feedback form link into the chat box. I believe that will go out in the follow-up email as well. But always love to hear your feedback on these. And yeah, thanks, Diana. These have been really, really informative and awesome. And happy to be able to provide this to our stewards and fellow AmeriCorps members. So
Thank you.
And thanks, Rachel, too. So.
Well, Diana did 95% of it.
Thank you, guys.
Nice job, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good
Have a
night.
good evening.
Thank you. Good night.